By the third spring, the routine had carved itself into Thomas Hale's life so deeply that it no longer felt like effort, but inevitability, a quiet alignment between his body and the land that woke him minutes before the alarm ever could, and by 4:00 a.m., he was already outside, boots damp with dew, notebook open to a fresh page, moving from one marked point to another, across the same 140 acres that most men would have walked past without noticing any difference. The numbers began to shift in a way that was no longer subtle, not dramatic enough to convince anyone else, but unmistakable to him. A repeating delay between surface temperature and subsoil warmth that seemed to lag by nearly 48 hours under specific wind conditions, especially after nights when the air cooled rapidly. But the soil retained a quiet reservoir of heat beneath the top inch. He started mapping these delays across sections of his farm, sketching rough grids in the margins of his notebook, marking where the pattern appeared strongest and where it faded, and slowly, almost reluctantly, began to see that his land was not uniform at all, but divided into invisible zones that responded to time differently, as if each section followed its own internal clock. When he mentioned this once at the local supply store, the reaction was immediate and dismissive. A few men exchanging glances, one of them laughing openly as he said that dirt didn't have a clock and that crops grew when the weather told them to grow, not when a man with a notebook decided they should. Thomas didn't argue, not because he lacked conviction, but because he understood something they didn't yet see, that the pattern was not about control but about timing, and timing required silence more than explanation. That year, he adjusted more than just planting dates, he staggered them, splitting his 140 acres into 4 distinct sections, each one planted according to the delayed heat pattern he had been tracking for over 2 years, spacing them out by intervals of 3 to 6 days, depending on the strength of the signal in his notes. And while this meant more passes with his aging tractor, more fuel, and more labor during a season, when efficiency was supposed to mean doing everything at once, he committed to it fully. Because for the first time, he was not reacting to the weather, he was anticipating it. The machinery itself told part of the story. An old John Deere that coughed to life each morning, its metal frame rattling slightly as it moved across fields that looked identical to anyone watching from a distance. Yet to Thomas, each pass felt different, each section carrying a memory of the numbers he had written down at 4:00 a.m., numbers that now guided his decisions more than forecasts or advice ever could. Spring turned to early summer, and the differences began to emerge more clearly, not just in color but in timing. Sections that had been planted later caught up faster than expected, their growth accelerating during brief windows when the soil released stored warmth back into the roots, while earlier sections, planted according to traditional schedules, plateaued in ways he had seen before but never fully understood. The contrast was no longer subtle. It stretched across acres, visible from the dirt road that cut along the edge of his property, where neighbors slowed their trucks just enough to take a longer look, not yet willing to admit anything had changed, but no longer laughing either. Still, the risk had not passed, because uneven timing meant uneven vulnerability, and when a sudden cold front moved through in late June, dropping nighttime temperatures lower than expected for 3 consecutive days, it exposed the very gamble Thomas had made. The sections that were ahead in growth faced stress, their leaves tightening under the cold, while the later planted sections, still developing, seemed to absorb the shift more gradually. For a moment, it looked like the entire system might collapse under the weight of its own complexity, that the pattern he trusted might not account for extremes, that the delay he had measured so carefully could become a weakness rather than an advantage. He stood in the field before sunrise on the 3rd day of that cold stretch, probe in hand, pressing it into soil that felt colder than it should, writing down numbers that no longer fit neatly into the patterns he had drawn, and for the first time in years, he hesitated, not in action but in belief, because the question that had once driven him forward now returned with a sharper edge, forcing him to confront the possibility that he had misunderstood something fundamental. Yet even in that uncertainty, He did not abandon the routine. He moved to the next point, and then the next, filling another page with data that refused to explain itself, trusting not the outcome but the process that had brought him this far. And as the sun finally rose over western Nebraska, casting a thin line of light across fields divided by invisible timing, one possibility began to take shape beneath the doubt, quiet but persistent, waiting for the next few days to confirm or destroy everything he had built so far. What if the pattern did not break under pressure, but revealed its true form only when the conditions became extreme? The cold passed more slowly than Thomas had hoped, and what remained afterward was not clarity, but a strange unevenness that spread across the farm like a question no one could answer at a glance. In some sections, the stalks seemed to recover with surprising speed, their leaves loosening again as if the stress had only brushed past them, while in others, especially the fields planted according to the county's usual schedule, growth turned hesitant and patchy, the green losing its confidence row by row. Thomas did not celebrate this difference, because he had learned by then that farming punished men who drew conclusions too early. But he did something more important. He began to treat the pattern not as a theory he was testing, but as a system he had to understand in full detail if it was ever going to carry the weight of a real future. That meant his mornings at 400 a.m. grew even more exacting. The notebook was no longer enough on its own, so he added hand-drawn symbols to mark crusting on the surface, root resistance at different depths, the smell of loosened soil after humid nights, the way some sections held a faint trace of warmth that could be felt through his gloves if he paused long enough. What other men would have called instinct, Thomas broke into parts. He measured how long the frost lingered in shaded edges near the windbreak. He noted which low spots stayed damp 2 mornings longer after a light rain. He tracked when the old combine left ruts that hardened by evening, and how those same ruts changed the way water sat after a storm. He wrote down the dates when southern winds arrived before sunrise and compared them with the behavior of the top inch of soil 2 days later. His farm was becoming less a piece of land and more a living instrument, and he was teaching himself slowly and stubbornly how to hear it. By late summer of 1971, after 3 full years of entries, the notebook had turned into several notebooks tied together with twine and stored in a kitchen drawer his wife rarely touched, not because she dismissed what he was doing, but because she sensed that those pages held the only map he trusted. Money, however, remained tight. Corn prices rose 1 month and sagged the next. Fuel was never cheap enough. Replacement parts for the tractor took longer to arrive every year. The county favored scale, and scale rewarded men who could buy certainty with steel. Thomas had none of that. His machinery was old, his acreage modest, and his methods impossible to explain in a sentence. That made him vulnerable in a way the others rarely had to face. If one season went badly, he did not have enough cushion to disguise it as strategy. If one gamble failed, it would not be discussed as innovation. It would be remembered as proof that he had wasted years chasing numbers in the dark. Perhaps that was why the mocking changed shape. It was no longer just laughter. It became advice. Men told him kindly enough on the surface that he had a sharp mind and should use it for something practical. They suggested he stop splitting fields into strange timings. They told him weather was too unpredictable for rituals. One neighbor, Earl Dunning, who farmed nearly 600 acres with 2 newer tractors and a reputation for saying exactly what others were thinking, stood by Thomas's truck one afternoon and told him, with no malice at all, that the problem was not his discipline but his scale. "A small farm makes a man romantic," Earl said. "You've got time to fall in love with ideas because your acres don't force you to be honest." Thomas said nothing, but the sentence stayed with him longer than he wanted, because part of him knew what Earl meant. Small operations did create room for unusual attention. Small mistakes, however, could become large humiliations just as easily. That fall, instead of backing away, Thomas rebuilt his planting map for the next year with even more precision. He divided the 140 acres into narrower bands. He marked them by thermal lag, moisture retention, exposure to early wind, and compaction from machinery paths. He adjusted his seeding depth section by section, changing it not by broad inches but by fractions, shallow where subsoil warmth rose faster, deeper where overnight cooling stayed trapped near the surface. He also altered how he used the planter itself, slowing the old machine in colder sections so seed placement stayed more consistent, then speeding slightly where the soil opened more cleanly. It took longer, it used more fuel, it demanded far more patience than any sensible person would recommend. But by doing so, Thomas moved from observation into craft. He was no longer merely noticing differences in his land, he was shaping his entire method around them, and that changed something inside him. The farm stopped feeling like a burden inherited from the past and started feeling like a design he could refine. When spring of 1972 arrived, the work unfolded almost like music. Each section entered at a different hour, each acre treated as though timing itself were part of the machinery, and for the first time, Thomas sensed that what he had built was not fragile curiosity but a working discipline. Then, just as the rows began to emerge with unusual uniformity, a violent May storm rolled across western Nebraska with hail, sideways rain, and wind strong enough to flatten wheat stands in a single night, and by dawn the county looked less like farmland than wreckage. The roads were littered with broken branches, tin roofing, and shredded leaves. Men drove from field to field without speaking much. Damage did not need explanation. It could be seen. Thomas walked his first section before sunrise with mud pulling at his boots, the leather notebooks wrapped in oilcloth under one arm, and everywhere he looked he saw signs of impact, snapped seedlings, beaten rows, water pooled in low ground, the kind of destruction that erased not just yield but confidence. Yet as he moved deeper into the farm, one detail began to trouble him in a way he could not immediately define. The damage was not evenly distributed. Some sections, especially those he had planted later according to the 4 am soil pattern, were bent but not broken, while other areas had been cut down almost level with the ground. He stopped at the edge of one narrow band and stared at two adjacent rows managed only days apart, one devastated, the other standing with a resilience that seemed almost impossible. The difference was so sharp it felt unnatural, as if the storm had chosen between them. And standing there in the wreckage, with hail still melting into the dark Nebraska dirt, Thomas realized the pattern had moved beyond temperature and timing and into something far more dangerous to believe, because if he was seeing correctly, then all these years he had not merely found a way to improve growth. He may have found a way to decide which parts of a field could survive when everything else failed. The days after the storm did not bring relief, only a slower, heavier kind of reckoning that settled over the county as men walked their fields and tried to calculate what had been lost, what could be salvaged, and what would never come back no matter how carefully they worked the soil again. Thomas did not rush to conclusions, because the pattern he had followed for 4 years had taught him that the first impression of damage was often the least accurate. But he could not ignore what he had seen. Those narrow bands of survival cutting through sections of destruction as if drawn by an unseen hand that knew exactly where to spare and where to strike. He returned to his routine the very next morning at 4:00 a.m., not out of habit this time, but out of urgency. Because if the storm had revealed something real, then the data he gathered now would matter more than anything he had recorded before. The soil felt different beneath the probe, heavier where water had pooled, looser where the impact had broken the surface, and in some sections, particularly those that had resisted the worst of the damage, there was a subtle warmth that did not match the air above it. If the ground itself had absorbed the shock and redistributed it in ways he did not yet understand. He wrote faster than usual, pages filling with numbers, symbols, short phrases that captured details too complex for simple measurements. And as he moved from one section to another, he began to notice a pattern layered on top of the one he had already been tracking. Something tied not just to temperature lag, but to how quickly the soil released or retained energy after being disturbed. By midday, the county had already begun its quiet comparisons. Men gathered at the grain elevator, speaking in low voices about flattened acres and insurance claims, about replanting costs and the slim chances of recovery. And when Thomas arrived, still carrying traces of mud on his boots, the conversation shifted just enough for him to feel it. A pause, a glance, the kind of attention that had nothing to do with respect yet, but was no longer rooted in dismissal. Earl Dunning was there again, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, arms crossed, watching Thomas in a way that suggested curiosity had replaced certainty, at least for the moment. "Heard you didn't get hit as bad," Earl said, not accusing, not praising, just stating something that had begun to circulate. Thomas nodded once, because anything more would have required an explanation he was not ready to give, and perhaps could not give even if he tried. What mattered was not what the others thought, but whether the pattern could be trusted under pressure, whether the narrow bands of survival were coincidence or consequence. That question followed him back to the fields where the real work began, not of planting or harvesting, but of understanding recovery. He mapped the damaged sections against his planting schedule, tracing where early timing had left seedlings exposed at the wrong stage, where delayed sections had stayed just behind the storm's most destructive window, and slowly, piece by piece, he saw how timing had intersected with vulnerability, how a difference of 3 or 4 days had meant the difference between stems that snapped and stems that bent. But even that explanation felt incomplete, because it did not fully account for the sections that had not only survived, but seemed to rebound faster, pushing new growth within days, as if the shock had triggered something rather than suppressed it. That was when Thomas returned to the notebook from 2 years earlier, flipping back through pages filled with morning measurements, searching for any sign that the soil had behaved this way before, and there, buried among hundreds of entries, found a sequence of notes taken after a minor hail event that most men would have forgotten. Notes that described a brief increase in subsoil warmth following surface disruption, a pattern he had noticed but never pursued because it had not seemed important at the time. Now it mattered. Now it connected. The storm had not only tested his system, it had revealed a second layer within it, one that suggested the soil could absorb energy from impact and release it in a way that accelerated recovery under certain conditions. Conditions he had unknowingly aligned with his delayed planting strategy. The realization did not arrive as excitement but as weight, because if he was right, then what he had built was no longer just a method for better timing. It was a framework that could influence resilience itself, and that kind of power came with risk he could not yet measure. He stood in the field at dusk, looking across acres that told 2 different stories at once, loss and survival existing side by side, and for the first time since he began waking at 4:00 a.m., he understood that the question was no longer whether the pattern was real, but whether he was willing to follow it to its full conclusion, even if it led him further away from everything the county believed about how farming was supposed to work. What followed in the weeks after the storm was not a return to normal, but a slow separation between 2 ways of farming that had once looked identical from a distance. In the damaged sections, replanting began almost immediately, men pushing seed back into the ground with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation, trying to reclaim what had been lost before the season closed its window, while in Thomas's fields the work moved with a different rhythm, not slower, but more deliberate, as if each decision had to pass through a filter built over years of quiet observation. He did not rush to replant the worst sections, not because he lacked the resources, but because his notes suggested something counterintuitive, that the soil in those areas needed time to release what it had absorbed, that forcing new growth too early might trap the system in a state of imbalance he did not yet fully understand. This decision did not go unnoticed. Earl drove by twice in 1 week, slowing just enough to see that Thomas had left parts of his land untouched, while others in the county were already pushing second attempts into the ground, and the old question returned, not spoken this time, but present in every glance. Was this patience, or was it hesitation disguised as method? Thomas felt the weight of that question each morning as he stepped into the fields before sunrise, because now the stakes were no longer theoretical. They were visible, measured in acres left bare and time that could not be recovered once lost. Yet the data continued to guide him, stubbornly consistent in a way that felt almost indifferent to human pressure. The subsoil warmth in the damaged sections peaked not immediately after the storm, but several days later, rising slowly as the compacted surface began to loosen, and the retained energy moved upward, creating a brief window that, according to his earlier notes, had the potential to support rapid root establishment if seeded at precisely the right moment. He waited for that window, not a day more, not a day less. When it arrived, he moved quickly, the old tractor cutting lines through soil that had just begun to open, seeds placed at depths adjusted by fractions, each pass timed against measurements taken only hours before. It was the most precise work he had ever done, not because the tools had improved, but because his understanding had. The rest of the county watched, some openly now, standing at the edges of fields or leaning against trucks, no longer laughing, not yet convinced, but drawn to something they could not easily dismiss. Time moved forward with attention that settled into every part of the season. Early replanted fields in neighboring farms struggled, some sprouting unevenly, others failing to emerge at all where the soil had not recovered from the storm's impact, while Thomas's delayed sections began to push through with a consistency that felt almost unnatural given the conditions. Rows appeared where there had been nothing just days before, green cutting through brown with a clarity that could be seen from the road, and with each passing morning the difference sharpened, no longer a subtle variation but a visible divide between methods. Earl returned again, this time not to comment but to stand in silence for several minutes, looking across two adjacent farms that had experienced the same storm and yet were telling entirely different stories. When he finally spoke, it was not to challenge Thomas, but to ask a single question that carried more weight than any criticism had before. "What are you seeing that we're not?" Thomas did not answer immediately, not because he wanted to protect what he had learned, but because he understood that the answer could not be given in a sentence. It was written across years of mornings, across pages filled at 4:00 a.m., across decisions that had seemed irrational until they were not. "Timing," he said eventually, though even as he spoke he knew the word was too small for what he meant. By harvest, the outcome could no longer be framed as luck or coincidence. The sections that followed the pattern, both before and after the storm, outperformed the rest of his farm by a margin that forced attention, not just in yield per acre, but in consistency, in resilience, in the way the crops seemed to move through stress without collapsing under it. The numbers told one story: bushels per acre rising beyond anything he had recorded before on that land, but the land itself told another, quieter one, of a system that responded differently when it was understood on its own terms rather than forced into uniform behavior. Word spread beyond the county, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as buyers noticed the quality of his crop, as neighboring farmers began to experiment in small ways, adjusting a field here, a planting date there, testing whether the pattern could be replicated without the years of data that had built it. Some saw improvement, others saw nothing at all, because what Thomas had created was not a trick, not a shortcut, but a discipline that required the same patience that had once made him an object of ridicule. That winter, for the first time in years, the numbers worked in his favor. The increased yield combined with a modest rise in corn prices brought his income to a level that changed the conversation around him. Not dramatically, but enough that the same men who had once dismissed him now asked questions with a different tone, one that carried a trace of respect mixed with something else, something closer to uncertainty. Thomas did not expand his acreage. He did not buy new machinery. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He began rewriting his notebooks, not copying them, but translating them into a system that could be followed without losing the detail that had made it work. A framework built around time, measurement, and restraint. The leather-bound pages remained, worn and filled with years of mornings, But beside them grew a new set of documents, cleaner, structured, an attempt to turn instinct broken into parts back into something that could be shared. And as he sat at the kitchen table late into the night, reorganizing years of quiet work into something that might outlast him, the symbol he had carried from the beginning, the notebook that no one had understood, took on a different meaning. No longer just a record of what had been observed, but a blueprint for what could be repeated, if someone was willing to wake before dawn and listen to the land long enough to hear what it had been saying all along. The years that followed did not turn Thomas Hale into a legend overnight, nor did they erase the memory of how quietly his work had begun. But they did something more enduring. They shifted the way a small part of western Nebraska thought about time, about land, and about the difference between reacting to conditions and understanding them deeply enough to move ahead of them. By the mid-1970s, a handful of farmers had started waking earlier, not all the way to 4 a.m., not at first, but earlier than before, stepping into their fields with a different kind of attention, pressing their boots into the soil, noticing how it felt before the sun changed everything. Some asked Thomas directly for guidance. Others tried to replicate what they believed he was doing without ever speaking to him, adjusting planting dates by a day or two, splitting fields into rough sections, testing ideas in small corners where failure would not cost them everything. A few saw improvements and credited the method. Many did not and returned to what they had always done, concluding that whatever Thomas had found was either too complex to matter or too specific to his land to be trusted elsewhere. Thomas never argued with either conclusion. He had learned long ago that understanding could not be transferred in words alone. It had to be built, slowly, through attention and repetition, through mornings that most people would never choose. His own routine never changed, even as his yields stabilized at levels that allowed him a margin he had never known before, even as corn prices rose and fell in cycles that no longer dictated his every decision. He continued to step out of his farmhouse before dawn, notebook in hand, moving across the same 140 acres that had once been dismissed as average. The difference was no longer in what he measured, but in how he interpreted it. The numbers had become familiar, the patterns less mysterious, yet he never allowed that familiarity to turn into assumption, because he understood that the land did not repeat itself out of obligation, only out of tendency, and tendency could shift without warning. There were seasons when the pattern weakened, when the delays he had tracked for years became less pronounced, when unexpected weather disrupted the timing he relied on, and in those moments, he returned to the beginning, to observation without expectation, to recording without forcing meaning onto what he saw. That discipline, more than any specific technique, became the true core of his work. By the early 1980s, the notebooks filled an entire shelf in his home, each one marked by year, edges worn, pages stained by dirt and time, a physical record of mornings that had shaped not only his farm, but his understanding of how systems revealed themselves to those willing to wait. The original leather notebook, the one he had carried in 1968, when the idea was nothing more than a quiet suspicion, remained separate, wrapped in cloth, rarely opened, not out of sentimentality but because its purpose had already been fulfilled. It had been the beginning. Everything after it had been the work of turning that beginning into something real. When Thomas finally spoke about what he had learned, it was not in terms of formulas or guarantees, but in a kind of language that felt closer to philosophy than instruction. He would say that most men tried to force the land to match their schedule, when the real advantage came from finding the land's schedule and aligning with it. He would say that speed often hid ignorance, that doing things faster made it easier to avoid noticing what was actually happening beneath the surface. And when asked why 4:00 a.m., why that exact hour, he would pause for a moment, as if considering whether the answer could be understood without experience, and then simply say that it was the only time when the land had not yet been interrupted, when the previous day and the coming day briefly overlapped, and in that overlap, patterns revealed themselves before they were flattened by heat, light, and human urgency. In the end, The greatest change was not measured in bushels or dollars, though those had improved beyond what anyone had expected from 140 acres of uneven Nebraska ground, but in the way Thomas related to uncertainty itself. Where others saw unpredictability as something to fight, he came to see it as something that could be listened to, not controlled but understood well enough to reduce its power. The farm never became perfect. There were still bad years, still losses, still moments when the pattern failed to deliver what he hoped it would. But those moments no longer defined the outcome because they were absorbed into a system that expected variation rather than feared it. And long after the numbers had proven his approach, long after the neighbors had stopped questioning and started quietly observing, Thomas Hale continued to wake at 4:00 a.m., step into the dark, and press a metal probe into the soil, not because he needed to prove anything anymore, but because the habit had become something deeper than method. It had become a way of seeing, a way of remaining connected to a process that began long before him and would continue long after he was gone, carried forward in the simplest of objects, a notebook filled one line at a time, by someone willing to notice what everyone else had already decided was too small to matter.